Have you ever found yourself sitting alone in your living room, staring out the window, wondering, what if something happened and no one knew? Maybe it's just a passing thought, a slight worry when you feel a bit dizzy, or when the phone rings late at night and it's no one you know. Or maybe, if you're like Frank, it's a feeling that lingers. Frank is 75. He's lived alone for almost a decade now, ever since his wife Carol passed. He still lives in the same house they built together, filled with the laughter of old memories and the quiet hum of the present. Most days, Frank enjoys his independence. He wakes up early, makes his own coffee, tends to his little garden, and even fixes the squeaky floorboards that never seem to stay quiet. But sometimes, just sometimes, that peace turns into something else. A question. A worry. What if I fall? What if I get sick? What if no one finds out until it's too late? If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. More than a quarter of Americans over 60 live by themselves, and while that brings a lot of freedom, it also comes with challenges we don't always talk about. Living alone doesn't mean living in fear, though. With a few small changes, you can keep your freedom and feel safe and supported. So today, let's talk heart-to-heart about 5 essential steps you can take to live alone safely, and just as importantly, happily, as you age. These steps aren't complicated. They're not expensive. But they could make all the difference between anxiety and peace of mind, between feeling alone and knowing someone's always just a moment away. Let's start with something simple but powerful: setting up a daily check-in. You see, one of the biggest risks of living alone isn't just the event itself. It's the delay in response. A fall, a fainting spell, or even a stroke can go unnoticed for hours, even days, if no one's checking in. Frank knew this. After hearing a story about a neighbor who wasn't found until 3 days after an accident, he made a small but life-changing decision. Every morning, Frank sends a short text to Mike, his neighbor down the road. Nothing fancy, just a quick, "all good here," or "morning." If Mike doesn't hear from him by 10 a.m., he gives him a call or drops by. It's simple. It's reliable. And it means that no matter what happens, Frank isn't invisible. You can do the same. Whether it's a neighbor, a friend, or a family member across the country, having that one person who knows to look for your message can mean everything. And if texting isn't your thing, there are other options. Some folks use check-in apps or devices that send alerts if there's no activity. Even smart plugs that turn lights on at certain times can be helpful. It doesn't take away your independence. In fact, it protects it. Because knowing someone is watching out for you lets you relax. It lets you focus on enjoying your day, not worrying about the what-ifs. Now, having someone check in is a great start, but let's talk about being ready if something does go wrong. Imagine this. You're in the kitchen making your famous chili, and suddenly your legs give out. You reach for your phone, but it's charging in the other room. You're on the floor, alone, and you don't know how long it'll be until help arrives. That's not just a scary thought, it's a dangerous reality. That's why having an emergency readiness plan is so important. Frank, for instance, keeps a printed list of emergency contacts taped to his fridge. Big print, easy to read. His doctor, his daughter in Seattle, and, of course, Mike. He's also programmed his phone so that even if it's locked, emergency responders can access his medical info. But what really gives Frank peace of mind is the small pendant he wears around his neck. It's not flashy, but it has a button, just one. If he presses it, it calls for help. If he falls and can't press it, it detects the fall and alerts someone anyway. No fumbling, no dialing, just help, right away. That tiny button? It's freedom in disguise. Because it lets Frank keep doing what he loves, gardening, walking around the block, even climbing the ladder to change light bulbs, without that weight of, what if I can't reach the phone? And here's something most people forget. Emergencies don't just mean medical problems. Fires, gas leaks, even a suspicious knock at the door, those are emergencies too. Frank has an escape plan for every room in his house. He keeps a flashlight by his bed, a spare key in a lockbox for emergency responders, and he never opens the door unless he's sure who's on the other side. Being prepared doesn't mean living in fear. It means living with confidence. It means knowing that even if something unexpected happens, you have a plan. You have control. And isn't that what we all want? Not just to survive, but to feel in charge of our lives? So let's recap gently here. Not with a list, but with a picture. Imagine yourself waking up each day knowing that someone will check in. Imagine having the tools and knowledge to respond if something goes wrong. Imagine not worrying, but living. Really living, with joy, with freedom, with peace. That's what these first steps are about. And just like Frank, you don't have to wait for something bad to happen to make a change. You can start small. You can start today. Maybe it's one text. Maybe it's putting a flashlight on your nightstand. Maybe it's just having that first conversation with someone you trust. Because when you take action, even tiny steps, you start to reclaim something powerful, your peace of mind. And as we keep going, we'll talk about other ways to protect that peace, to strengthen your home, and to guard your independence, not just with tools and plans, but with connection, with purpose, and with joy. Let's keep going. When Frank first decided to live alone after Carol passed, he didn't think much about home security. After all, he lived in a quiet neighborhood where folks still waved at each other from across the lawn. But one night just before bed, he got a phone call that rattled him. A man claimed to be from his bank, said there had been suspicious activity on his account, and asked for his account number and full name to verify. Frank almost gave it to him, but something in the man's tone felt off. He hung up, called the bank himself, and sure enough, it had been a scam. That one phone call changed the way Frank thought about safety. Because the truth is, when you live alone, you're not just responsible for your own well-being, you also become your first line of defense. Scams like that are becoming more and more common. In fact, seniors are one of the top targets for scammers today. They'll pretend to be the IRS, a utility company, even a long-lost grandchild needing bail money. And the worst part? They're good at it. They sound professional. They use fear and urgency. And they count on you being alone, without someone to turn to in that moment. That's why Frank put a new rule in place. If anyone asks for personal information over the phone, email, or even in person, he checks first. He calls his nephew Jason. If Jason says it sounds fishy, Frank doesn't respond. No questions asked. It's a simple rule, but it saved him from making more than one expensive mistake. He also made a few upgrades to his home. Nothing too fancy, just enough to make any would-be scammer or intruder think twice. He swapped out the old door locks for newer, reinforced deadbolts. He added motion sensor lights outside, so any movement after dark gets lit up like a Christmas tree. And perhaps most importantly, he installed a smart doorbell with a camera. Now, when someone comes to his door, he can see them from inside, or even from his phone, before ever opening it. It's not about being paranoid. It's about being practical. When you live alone, every little step you take to make your home more secure is a step toward peace of mind. And here's something else you might not expect. Frank even put up a fake security sign in his front yard. He doesn't actually have a full system, but the sign alone is often enough to make someone think twice before approaching. Sometimes it's not about what you have. It's about what they think you have. But let's take a moment to talk about something that might be even more dangerous than scams or break-ins. Falling. It sounds simple, doesn't it? Just a fall. But for older adults, one wrong step can mean a trip to the emergency room, a long recovery, or worse. Every year, millions of seniors are hospitalized because of falls, and many of them happen right at home. Frank learned that lesson the hard way. One morning, while reaching for a box of cereal on a high shelf, he stepped backward onto a throw rug that had curled at the edge. Down he went. It wasn't a bad fall, thankfully, but it was enough to shake him. And it got him thinking, what if it had been worse? So he took action. First, he made small changes around the house. That rug? Gone. Any loose wires or cords? Tucked away. He replaced dim bulbs with bright LED lights, especially in the hallway and the bathroom. He even installed grab bars in the shower and next to the toilet. They don't just help with balance. They give you confidence in places where slips are most common. These kinds of adjustments don't take much time or money, but they can dramatically reduce your risk of falling. And they help you feel more secure in your own space, which is what this is all about. But Frank didn't stop there, because he knew the house wasn't the only part that needed attention. His body did too. As we age, it's easy to forget how quickly strength and balance can fade. You don't need to run marathons or lift heavy weights to stay strong. You just need to keep moving. That's why every morning Frank does a few simple exercises right in his living room. Nothing intense. A few chair stands to strengthen his legs. Some heel-to-toe walking to help with balance. A couple of ankle rolls while sitting to keep things loose and mobile. It's a routine that takes 5, maybe 10 minutes, but it's made a huge difference. He doesn't get winded walking to the mailbox anymore. He doesn't worry about climbing the stairs or stepping into the shower. He feels stronger, more in control. And that confidence carries into everything else he does. Because here's the thing, falling isn't just physical. It affects your confidence, your independence, the way you move through your day. And the more afraid you are of falling, the more likely you are to avoid movement, and the weaker your body gets. It's a cycle. But the good news? You can break it with just a few minutes a day. And even if a fall does happen, because sometimes, despite our best efforts, it will, Frank has a plan. He always keeps his phone within reach. If he goes out to the garden or into the garage, his emergency pendant is around his neck. And just as importantly, he's learned how to get up safely if he falls. Roll to the side, get to a seated position, and take your time. Don't rush. Don't panic. It's that mix of preparation, strength, and mindset that helps Frank live with the freedom he loves, without the constant fear that something might go wrong. Because living alone doesn't mean living on edge. It means taking control of your space, your body, and your safety. It means being smart, staying strong, and making small adjustments that add up to a big difference. And perhaps most importantly, it means remembering that you don't have to do it all alone. Because sometimes, the biggest risk isn't a fall or a scam, or even a health scare. Sometimes, it's silence. Let's talk about that next. Frank never thought of himself as lonely. Not at first. He told himself he liked the quiet. After all, he'd earned it. A full life, a long marriage, years of raising kids, building furniture with his own hands, mowing the same lawn every Saturday for decades. He'd done it all. So when Carol passed, he just settled into the silence. At first, it wasn't so bad. He had his morning coffee, his crossword puzzles, his favorite chair by the window. But after a while, the days began to blur together. Meals were quieter, evenings were longer. He caught himself talking to the TV more than to people. And the house, once filled with the rhythm of two lives, started to feel still in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was empty. He brushed it off, of course. Told himself he didn't need much. Just a little peace and quiet. But then came the night he couldn't sleep. No reason, really. Just wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The kind of night where you feel like you're the only person awake in the whole world. And in that moment, something clicked. He realized he hadn't spoken to anyone in 3 days. Not a phone call. Not a visitor. Nothing. That realization hit hard. You see, we don't always notice loneliness creeping in. It doesn't show up like a fever or a cough. It arrives slowly, quietly. It hides in the spaces between conversations. It grows in the silences we tell ourselves are just peaceful. But loneliness isn't just emotional. It's physical. Studies have shown that chronic isolation can increase the risk of heart disease, dementia, and even early death. In fact, Being socially isolated can have the same impact on your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And that's not just a statistic, that's a wake-up call. Frank needed a change. And change came from the unlikeliest place, the hardware store. He had gone in to pick up a few screws and left with something far more valuable. A conversation. A familiar voice called out, "Tom," an old friend from years back. They got to chatting, laughing about the time they built a deck together in the middle of a rainstorm. Before parting ways, Tom mentioned a local woodworking club that met every Thursday at the community center. Frank hesitated. It had been a long time since he'd been part of any group. But something about that invitation stuck. That Thursday, he showed up. Nervous. Unsure. He brought some old tools and an even older folding chair. But the moment he stepped into that room, something shifted. There were other folks there, men and women who had lived through the same things, who understood the quiet. They weren't loud. They weren't flashy. They were just present. And being with them reminded Frank what he'd been missing. It wasn't about being surrounded by people 24/7. It was about having someone to laugh with, someone to swap stories with, someone to say, "Hey, I get it." That woodworking club became his anchor. It gave structure to his week. It gave him reasons to smile. It gave him friends. And that's the beauty of staying socially connected. It doesn't require big crowds or fancy events. Sometimes all it takes is a shared hobby, a walk with a neighbor, or a 5-minute phone call to an old friend. There are countless ways to reconnect, no matter your situation. Maybe there's a community center nearby that hosts weekly card games or art classes. Maybe your church has a small group that meets for coffee. Or maybe your granddaughter has been trying to teach you Zoom and you've been politely avoiding it. Maybe now's the time to give it a try. Even online groups can offer real connection. There are virtual book clubs, gardening forums, and video calls with folks across the country who just want to talk about life, share memories, or trade recipes. Because here's what Frank discovered. Connection isn't just about companionship. It's about protection, too. When you're socially connected, people notice things. They check in when something feels off. They remember your routines. They ask how you're doing, not out of obligation, but out of care. And that care creates a safety net that no security system can replace. Frank still lives alone. He still wakes up to a quiet house. But now, there's a text from Mike every morning. A Thursday night filled with sawdust and smiles. A call from Jason every Sunday. And the knowledge that he is not in any way alone. So what does all this mean for you? It means that living alone doesn't have to mean living in fear or in silence or in the shadows of what if. It means that with a few simple steps, daily check-ins, emergency readiness, a secure home, fall prevention, and genuine connection, you can shape your future instead of waiting for something to go wrong. You can take control, like Frank did. You can turn worry into wisdom, isolation into inspiration, and a quiet house into a place of strength, peace, and joy. And if you've been feeling overwhelmed or unsure where to start, just remember this. The first step doesn't have to be big. It just has to be yours. Send that text. Call that friend. Move that rug. Buy that pendant. Show up to that group. Say yes, just once. Because one small step, today, could make all the difference tomorrow. And if you found this video helpful, I hope you'll take a moment to hit that like button. It helps more people discover this content. People just like you who might need it most. And don't forget to subscribe to Strong Elderly Life for more honest, practical advice to help you thrive in every stage of life. We'd love to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. What's one thing you've done or plan to do to live more safely and happily on your own? Your words might inspire someone else to make a change too. Here's to you, to strength, to freedom, and to living your best life at any age. You've got this.